What if the global diplomacy today works like a children's board game, where you capture the leader, control the resources, and win the round? Now, the recent action of US in Venezuela makes the world ask a very pertinent and important question: that has international law become optional for the countries? And if it is so, then is it just optional for the developed countries like US, or is it optional for all?
Now let's take you inside the US military operation that captured Nicolás Maduro. The mission was called Operation Absolute Resolve. It began with months of planning. American intelligence tracked every movement of President Maduro, his routine, his security, and the structure of the safe house.
For months, the United States had been watching Nicolás Maduro, every routine and movement.
Explosions ripped through Caracas, bright flashes in the sky, deep rumbling blasts, and fires burning on the hillsides.
It's a long walk to face the wrath of American justice for Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia. Dressed in matching tan prison uniforms, they're led in handcuffs from a chopper, headed to their first court appearance, surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. Then to a helicopter for the brief flight to Lower Manhattan. Another armored truck transported them to the federal courthouse for their arraignment.
Now, as all of you would know, recently US attacked Venezuela, and not just attacked Venezuela, took a control over the entire Venezuela country, which is again a separate country, a sovereign country, separate from United States of America. And not just this, US also captured the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife and other senior officials. And right now, the leadership or the control of Venezuela is in the hands of US. Now, the simple, very innocent reasons given by the US administration for doing this was migration, drugs, and narco-terrorism perpetrated by Venezuela, which was hurting the interests of United States of America. But we all know that this is not true. This is just the curtain, and the reality is deep, deep within, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Not just the tip, it is just the superficial part of the iceberg. The real iceberg, or the real reason, is oil and petrodollar equation. Now, we'll be dealing with the reasons later on, but first of all, this action was justified by the US administration as Trump's corollary to Monroe's Doctrine of 1823, which marks a sharp escalation in the US interventionism in Latin America in the 21st century global diplomacy. And definitely, now this is not just a threat to Latin America, not just a threat to Southern America, it is a threat to the entire world. Now, this is not all, because US President Donald Trump has also talked about recently taking over Greenland, which is right now under the control of Denmark.
It's a great move.
What would the justification be for a claim to Greenland? What would the justification?
Oh, I don't want to talk about Greenland now. I just say this. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And the European Union needs us to have it, and they know that.
Now, what are the key reasons why US had to intervene in Venezuela, and what will be the key repercussions of this action in the global diplomacy? Of course, the case of India, and what Donald Trump is going to do in future in global diplomacy, and is World War III on the charts? All these three things we're going to discuss in today's session. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh, and you're watching Perspective. First of all, let me describe Venezuela for all of you. Venezuela is a federal multi-party republic with a unicameral legislature and Caracas, which is serving as its capital. Now, if you see geographically, Venezuela is located at the northern end of Southern America with coastlines along the Caribbean Sea and Atlantic Ocean. It also shares its land boundaries, if you can see on the map, Guyana to the east, Brazil to the south, and Colombia to the southwest and west. Now, why Venezuela is such an interesting country? Because Venezuela is very rich in petroleum and natural gas reserves, with its economy historically being dominated by oil. And when we talk about oil, Venezuela is having the world's largest oil reserves. And when we talk about oil, Venezuela holds the world's largest oil reserves ever, which is around 300 billion barrels. And this is actually 1/5 or around 18 to 20% of the global oil reserves in the entire world. Second number is the Saudi Arabia, which is the largest oil producer in the world. So which is why Venezuela, with this perspective, becomes very, very important and very, very interesting. Also, one more important thing is that Venezuela was one of the founding members of Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, that is OPEC. But currently, it is only contributing to around 3.5% of the OPEC exports of crude oil and also 1% of the global oil supplies. Over the last many years, US President Donald Trump has criticized Venezuela for perpetrating narco-terrorism in the land of US. Not just that, for migration crisis in US, one of the main perpetrators, according to US President Donald Trump, is Venezuela. And Donald Trump has time and again accused the Maduro's government of emptying prisons and asylums and forcing inmates to migrate to US, which of course the claims have been rejected by Venezuela altogether. And not just that, also Washington time and again has reiterated that Venezuela is a key transit route for entering cocaine into US. And not just that, it is also responsible for US fentanyl crisis. Now, of course, these claims have been rejected by Venezuela, but this is what US has been claiming since the last many years. And finally, what we saw on 3rd of January 2026 was that US Special Forces conducted an Operation Absolute Resolve, to take over Venezuela and also to capture the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, and take them to US for charges related to narco-terrorism, drug trafficking, and migration crisis in US. Now, one thing which we must keep in mind is that all these things or all these actions taken by the US was not concurred by international law. UN General Assembly had no role to play in this. Any international organization was not consulted. No international organization, no international law was consulted while the US put out this operation. Which means simply that the US arbitrarily went to a sovereign country, went to a sovereign nation, captured its resources, controlled the resources, and captured its president, the wife of the president, and took them back to US. Now, if you look at it from a distance and think wisely, this is no less than a children's board game. It is like children playing conquerors, where whoever will conquer the king first will control the resources and will win the round. Now, this is nothing short of this particular board game which is played by children in a school. No value for international law whatsoever, no value for global diplomacy whatsoever, no value for rule-based international law whatsoever. Whatever US would want would happen in the world. This is what this particular act of US President and US Special Forces shows to the world. Now, US President and the authorities in US have been arguing about one doctrine, that is Monroe Doctrine, which is of 1823, and they argue that it was in line with Monroe's doctrine, the actions can be justified. See, first of all, let us understand what is Monroe Doctrine. Now, it is named after a former US President, James Monroe. Now, Monroe Doctrine began as a symbolic 19th century declaration opposing new or expanded European involvement in the Americas after colonial rule has ended. It simply means that in 1823, James Monroe articulated that any European power now would not be intervening in America, which means European power should not establish any new colonies in American region, and any attempt by any external power to influence the Western Hemisphere nations would be viewed as hostile to US. This is what Monroe's doctrine discussed about. But over a period of time, US broadened this doctrine, and they started treating Latin America as a strategic sphere of influence. Basically, this shift turned the doctrine as a key justification of US interventionism in the Latin America, which means that if European power intervenes in Latin America or any of the American colonies, it would be treated as something which is against US. Earlier, it was a protective policy to protect the American region, but over a period of time, it became a justification given by the US to protect the areas of Latin America, and in the pretext of protecting the areas of Latin America, US would justify intervention in Latin America as well. They will be intervening in the internal affairs of several countries with the pretext of supporting them and protecting them from European powers. So basically, it became a reason for the US to meddle into the internal affairs of countries in Latin America. And examples of it can be seen in 1904, when Theodore Roosevelt, again with his own corollary, established Monroe's Doctrine and asserted that US rights to exercise international police power in Latin America countries should be there. And it is there to address the atrocities in Latin America, the wrongdoings in Latin America, and instability and governance failures, whereby again they justified US interventionism in other countries. And not just this, later on during the Cold War era as well, this particular doctrine was invoked to counter several countries with Soviet influence, like that of Cuba, Central American and Southern American countries as well. Now, post-Cold War era, this doctrine was no longer used because the world was of multilateralism. But again, this doctrine has resurfaced due to Donald Trump, whereby he has invoked this doctrine again to justify its intervention in Venezuela. Now, all these reasons, all these discussions which we have heard till now, this is the stance of US and what US has been saying that why they intervened in Venezuela. But we all know these are not the real reasons. If you have to know the real reason that why US intervened in Venezuela, why US captured its president and the wife of the president, you have to understand about the oil reserves in Venezuela. As I've already told you, there are two key reasons why US has intervened. First is the oil reserves, which is massive in Venezuela, more than any country in the world. It is having around 300 billion barrels of oil reserves currently as of today in Venezuela, which means they are around 1/5 of the global oil reserves, which is the highest. Around 20% of the world's reserves, oil reserves, are with Venezuela. Second place is of Saudi Arabia, which is the largest producer of the oil in the world. Now, this is the first reason. US wanted control over the oil in Venezuela. If US has a control over the oil in Venezuela, first of all, US would be able to sell this particular oil, which Donald Trump is obviously planning to. And US oil companies would get rich just overnight, which means economic reason was the first reason. That US in today's international world was losing its economic might to China, which is why US had to do this to regain its economic might, first of all in relation to oil. This is the first reason. The second reason is the petrodollar equation. Now, to understand this petrodollar equation, first of all, you have to understand that earlier in the Bretton Woods system, dollar was pegged with gold. That is, the value of the dollar would be determined with the value of gold. But in 1971, when the Bretton Woods system failed, President Richard Nixon ended the convertibility of dollar into gold. Now, once that was done, in the year 1974, the birth of petrodollar equation would start, which means that the advisor of President Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, would go to Saudi Arabia and would tell Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia from now on would sell petroleum, crude oil to the world with US dollars, which means in exchange of US dollars, Saudi Arabia is going to sell petroleum. Now, this was a very important move. This was a very big move because Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of the oil in the world. Now, if Saudi Arabia is to sell crude oil and take a US dollar in return, it would make US dollar dominant in the world. But why would Saudi Arabia do so? US government would tell Saudi Arabia that we will give you military support. And in return of that military support, you have to accept US dollar when you sell crude oil to the world. Now, because of this, dollar got pegged with petrol, which means now mostly the crude oil in the world would be sold with the US dollar. And because now US dollar would be more in demand, US economy would be better off than before because dollar would become the most dominant currency in the world. And this is where dollar as the world's reserves currency started. And slowly, US started doing these kind of pacts with the other oil producing countries as well. And over a period of time, till 1990s, you will see the only currency which will dominate the world will be US dollar. Now, any country which would challenge this petrodollar equation is a threat to US, is a threat to US economy. Now, first challenge to this petrodollar equation was done by Iraq. And which is why in the year 2003, US invaded Iraq and US-Iraq was started. And this is with the period of Saddam Hussein. And after this, the second challenge was done in the year 2009 in Libya, where Gaddafi challenged this. And after this, you all know that the US intervened in Libya and Gaddafi did. And now, Venezuela challenged this petrodollar equation and said that they would be selling crude oil to Russia in rubles, to China in Chinese yuan, which is why again it challenged the petrodollar equation, and which is why it again became a threat to US, it again became a threat to US economy and threat to US dollar, which is why again you see that the US intervened into Venezuela, took all its oil reserves, and now US companies would be selling the oil reserves of Venezuela. So this is entire chronology and entire thing can be linked together to show why US intervened into Venezuela and took over its oil reserves. See, now since we have understood the whole equation fair and clear, the question which we must ask ourselves and which the world must ask as well is that currently in today's day and age, is US so powerful that can US escape after doing any wrongdoings in the world, or can US do anything in the world and there is no ramification and no repercussion for this? What is the answer? I'll leave it for you. And do let me know what is your view in the comment section. Now coming to India's stance. So now the question is, what is the stance of India? See, India is cautiously restraining on saying anything on this matter because India is already talking to US and is already suffering from the US tariffs which Donald Trump has put on India. And of course, Donald Trump is talking about imposition of more tariffs on India, which is why India is now maintaining cautious restrictive stance. But will there be any impact of this on India? The answer is no, because India imports only 1% or even less than 1% of crude oil from Venezuela of its total oil imports. Only few $100 million is the total import of India with respect to oil from Venezuela, which is why on our energy security, on our crude oil import, there won't be much impact after this US control of the Venezuelan oil reserves. So, but the larger question which we have to address over here is that this crude oil, the reserves of the crude oil, it belongs to the people of Venezuela. It belongs to Venezuela as a whole because it is a part of the natural resource of Venezuela. What on earth is US doing selling that crude oil in the world and taking profits from it? And what moral right or what economic right is US having over that particular crude oil? This is the question which we need to ask bluntly. Because logically speaking, any rational mind would say that the answer is US has no right to do anything with the oil reserves of Venezuela because it belongs to the people of Venezuela and not at all related to US. Which is why US going to Venezuela, controlling its oil reserves, and now going to sell its oil reserves and making a profit out of it is nothing short of a bully behavior which children do in schools. And this kind of behavior definitely needs to be condemned. Now, this is not all, because US President Donald Trump is also talking about taking over Greenland because of the strategic location of Greenland between Europe, Russia and US. See, this is where it becomes very problematic. That Greenland today is an autonomous territory under the Kingdom of Denmark. And Denmark is a founding member of NATO. And the US is also a very prominent part and the most prominent part of NATO. And under NATO, it is very clearly written that any party or any war against any member of NATO would be treated as a war against entire NATO members, which means all the NATO members would be willing to protect that particular country which is at war with some other external third country. Which is why if this particular thing happens, where Denmark is a part of NATO and US is part of NATO and Denmark is also part of European Union as well, European Union would be siding with Denmark and US would be left out. And this would simply mean dismembering of NATO altogether. And also, this would mark end of NATO, and this would also mark the prolonged decades-long cooperation between European Union and United States of America, which is why geopolitically it would be very, very harmful for the entire global geopolitics, for the entire international order, global order, plus the relationship between USA and European Union would get sour. Now let's see, and do tell me in the comment section that do you see this happening anytime soon or not, whereby US would capture Greenland or not, and what are your views surrounding the entire issue? Do let me know in the comment section. All the very best and have a beautiful day. Thank you.